Welcome to a Sandra Day O'Connor Institute Issues and Answers conversation about the current state and future of urban America. I'm Liam Julian, Policy Director for the O'Connor Institute. Tracy Hadden Lowe is a fellow with the A&T and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking at Brookings Metro, part of the Brookings Institution. She serves on the boards of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority and Greater Washington. Her most recent writing includes two co-authored chapters in Hyperlocal, Place Governance in a Fragmented World, and a series on the future of downtowns, including what to do about public safety and adaptive reuse. Stijn van Nieuwerburgh is the Earl W. Casas and Benjamin Shore Professor of Real Estate and Professor of Finance at Columbia University's Graduate School of Business. His research lies in the intersection of housing, asset pricing, and macroeconomics. He's published quite widely. He has served as an advisor to the Norwegian Minister of Finance and has been a visiting scholar at the Central Bank of Belgium, the New York and Minneapolis Federal Reserve Banks, the Swedish House of Finance, the International Center for Housing Risk, and has contributed to the World Economic Forum project on real estate price dynamics. Dr. Hadden Lowe and Dr. Van Nieuwerburgh, thanks so much for being here with us.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Hadden Lowe, we'll start with you. I think people generally have a kind of a sense of the outline of what has happened with urban America, broadly understood in the last 5 years with COVID-19, work from home, emptying out downtowns, and to some degree, and cities taking a hit. But I think there's less understanding of where we are today. Where is urban America today? What is the state of urban America now? Of course, urban America being very different maybe from city to city, but maybe you could tell us sort of where we find ourselves now.
Great question. I'm not sure actually that everyone does understand exactly
Yeah.
what it is that's happened that's impacting cities so much, right? So basically, cities are all about proximity and bringing people together. And the coronavirus pandemic was an extraordinary and unusual situation in which, especially in the early days of the pandemic, as a strategy to contain the spread of the disease, we stayed apart from each other, which is the opposite of what cities do. And so the distancing requirements of the pandemic disrupted not just office work, but also tourism and all of the local non-work travel that people do, like socializing, for example. And all of those aggregate disruptions it's just a really big change in how and where we spend our time and how we get around. And that has been really difficult for cities to adjust. It's been really difficult for human beings to adjust to.
Right.
And so, of course, it's been difficult for cities to adjust to as well.
Yep. Well, Dr. Van Nieuwerburgh, you've done a lot of work looking at quantifying the effects of, for example, as Dr. Hadlen was saying, remote work on commercial real estate. And you've written about this so-called urban doom loop. Maybe you talk a little bit about that, what that is, and sort of some of your work in that area.
Absolutely. So, Liam, like you said, and the pandemic brought large changes in how we work and live, and it pushed a lot of us out to the suburbs. A lot of people left downtown areas. And, even those that might have intended to come back, once you purchase a home in the suburbs, it makes that return to the office, and the return to the city that much more complicated. And so we find ourselves 4 years later with, substantial adoption and persistence of working from home. Right. By some measures, about 30% of paid days are still work from home, which is, a fourfold increase over the pre-pandemic state of affairs. And we find ourselves with, dramatically lower demand for offices. Now, it's not just these office buildings that are affected. It's all the surrounding, services that are provided to these office workers. Think of, the salad lunch place down the street and so forth. Right. And so all of this has led to, I think, potential challenges, and some of these challenges for cities, and some of these challenges are only just now beginning to play out. I like to think of this crisis as a train wreck in slow motion. It's extremely slow moving because the underlying leases on these offices are very long term. The underlying mortgage debt is very long term, and the property taxes that cities collect from commercial properties are very backward looking. And so a lot of these value declines are only now beginning to get realized, and the tax hit has really not taken place yet, or is only just barely beginning to take place. But looking forward, the idea of the urban doom loop is that, as office values fall 30, 40, 50%, that will impact the component of tax revenues that comes from commercial property. In many cities, that's around 10% of the overall budget. And because cities have to balance their budget, they will need to either raise taxes on other items, which is never popular and never good for business, or they will need to cut spending. And that's things like public safety, transportation, education, sanitation, all of which deteriorate the quality of life in the city and could lead to out-migration. And of course, when people move out, that aggravates the initial problem. And so you get into this vicious cycle, which I've coined the urban doom loop.
Yeah, yep. That's so. Question on this: to what extent is the urban doom loop? Well, you're in New York City, Dr. Van Nieuwerburgh, and New York City is looking at potentially billions in budget shortfalls in the future. Is that correct?
Yes. So New York City is unique in many ways. On the one hand, it's a very well diversified economy. It's a very vibrant city. It's the place of all cities where young people want to be the most. So we have a lot of good things going for us. At the same time, we are facing substantial budget issues. Some of that has to do with the expiration of federal help to cities. We cannot forget that during COVID, there was massive fiscal support from the federal government to the local governments that is now running out. And some of it has to do with the migrant crisis, which has hit the major cities really, really hard. New York City is spending $5 billion in the next 2 years on shelter and on the migrant crisis. So, what I'm talking about, the hit to commercial property taxes, has barely begun and needs to be seen in this context of already large budget gaps. There's forecasts that project New York City has about a $5 plus billion fiscal shortfall in each of the next 5 years, even before we incorporate the effects that I'm talking about.
Dr. Hadden, you've written a lot about downtowns. To the extent that you agree with what Professor Van Nieuwerburgh is saying, what are some solutions that you see or that certain municipalities have been using to kind of combat this doom loop idea?
Okay, so the first thing is that while it's true that remote work is sticky because, especially in cities where the average commute length is longer,
Mm-hmm.
people just don't want to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We also have to address if there are other reasons that are barriers to return to office that are under the control of cities. So because the more that we can kind of soften the blow in terms of how much office utilization is going to fall, the less adaptation is necessary to a new reality, right? Like, does it really need to be a 30% drop in utilization forever? I think this is a question we have to ask because if we look globally, utilization is much higher across a variety of urban contexts in Europe, Asia, Australia. So there is something different going on in the United States. That's something that we need to address. And so this is like the extent of suburbanization, but it's also like going after the basics in terms of how cities are run and how the services that Stijn was talking about are provided. So for example, if concerns about public safety are part of what is limiting return to office, then we need to directly address those concerns, both the perceptions and the underlying realities, in order to get after a barrier that should not be in place to making the most out of our existing built environment and infrastructure.
I see. And that's a great point. To the extent that but there, do we all agree that there is the current amount of office space in American cities is too much, so to speak.
There's a chunk of it. There's a
Right.
chunk of it that's functionally obsolete.
That's
Right?
functionally
It's the
obsolete.
issue that's going on. It's not just that. Yes, there has been this kind of like this shock that's a structural reduction in aggregate demand.
Yep.
But the issue is that the other trend that's going on is that the way people are using offices, it was changing before the pandemic, and the pandemic has now greatly accelerated that change. Right? Because if telework enables me to do my independent work comfortably at home.
Yep.
There's no need for the cost of a commute in order to capture that productivity. So now the point of going to an office is to collaborate. And that requires a really different kind of office than a lot of the inventory that's concentrated in downtowns, which are just older than a lot of other office clusters.
Right.
So the functionally obsolete stuff has to be either torn down or turned into something else.
Okay.
And reducing that slack in the office market will also help strengthen demand for the remaining product.
I see. That's interesting. I just read, in the Wall Street Journal, an article about Detroit and sort of how they're trying to revitalize the downtown in Detroit. And GE, has this, GM has this giant, building, and it's like, what are we going to do with this thing? So, Professor Van Nieuwerburgh, what are they going to do with it? I mean, we, of course, in this country at the moment, people like to point out too much office space and a housing shortage. It seems like there's a connection there, but that's much more difficult than it seems. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I would say I'm a conversion optimist. In the sense that, I think we can all agree there's too much office. I think the only question is there like 20% too much or 40% too much? Certainly we need office in the future. And I completely agree with Tracy that removing some of that excess supply will help stabilize the office market. So then the question is, what do we do with the remainder? And I think we need a three-pronged approach. One approach is some of the office needs to be upgraded, right? Sort of we turn it from Class B into Class A. We make it environmentally sustainable. We make it electrified. We make it state of the art so people want to be there. We make it collaboration spaces. Another point of it is we need to keep an open mind about what good use is. At the end of the day, we want to create neighborhoods where people want to live, which means we don't just need housing. We also need retail for them. We need some innovator space. We need some cultural amenities. We need some schools. We need some educational facilities. But by and large, you're right. We do need a lot of housing, right? Because we have sort of a historical unaffordability problem right now in America, including and maybe most prominently in our major cities. And so it seems like a natural solution. There are a range of obstacles. In my mind, the most important obstacle is an economic obstacle. Right now, even if the building is physically suitable for conversion, even if it has all the regulatory approvals it needs, the economics of it barely pencil out. And the reason is in large part due to the high cost of interest rates right now. It's just very hard to finance, and the really expensive cost of converting. And so, I've done a study on this called Converting Brown Offices to Green Apartments. I've actually recently updated some of these calculations, and things have become even more difficult because interest rates have continued to go up, and now they look sort of less likely to fall anytime in the near future. So that is really a bottleneck. And the good news is cities have been putting into place subsidies to facilitate these conversions, usually associated with an affordable housing mandate. We could talk about that if you like. But I think that the physical obstacles, which are emphasized a lot, are actually less of a problem, because at the end of the day, it's a money problem. A lot of buildings can be converted. Sometimes it's more expensive if the building is more complicated or larger or deeper floor plates, but it can usually be done. It's just a matter of money.
Well, Dr. Hadden-Lowe, if it's a matter of money and cities are already sort of, their budgets are stressed and looking like they're going to be stressed in the future, who's paying?
Well, that's a great question. So, the last generation of adaptive reuse was unlocked by the federal government, first and foremost, through offering tax credits for historic preservation. And those tax credits still exist today. Many states also have a state version of that tax credit that stacks on top, that has made a lot of these projects feasible. The challenge right now is that the obsolete offices that I was talking about, a lot of it is kind of like gross cube product from the 80s
Right.
that's not what anyone has in mind
Right.
when they're talking about historic preservation.
Right.
So, I think that Stan is really onto something when he's talking about trying to internalize the economics of the aggregate benefit to society that there is when a building is recycled and adaptively reused instead of being torn down in terms of carbon that remains sequestered in the structure of the building. So, a tax credit that acknowledges the climate value of that benefit is something that intellectually makes sense
Hmm.
and that the federal government has the power to provide. And it's analogous to tax credits that the federal government has provided before.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I was reading in that article that I mentioned earlier about Detroit, how Detroit sort of benefited from two things, I guess. Number one, it's got this the guy who runs Rocket Mortgage, whose name sort of flew out of my mind just now.
Dan Gilbert.
Yeah, who is just devoted to just dumping millions into the revitalization of downtown Detroit. And also, the buildings in downtown Detroit are buildings you would want to preserve. They're beautiful, old, historical stone buildings. And I was reading that the actual construction of those buildings makes them better able to be converted to housing because they're not these huge open floor plans. They are actually small sort of offices. And so it's very interesting how certain areas it's sort of a place by place. But Dr.
On the Detroit example, though, and I think this is highly illustrative, everything you said is true. Dan Gilbert has extraordinary access to capital,
Mhm.
and tax credits played a huge role in the investments that he's made inside the People Mover Loop in Detroit. But I also want to point out that Dan Gilbert was able to buy a lot of those buildings for basically like $1. and,
Yeah.
and that the reason why those buildings were available for so cheap is because of the level of municipal fiscal distress that Detroit fell into prior to that revitalization.
Yes.
It is not going to be good for cities or for the American economy as a whole for all US downtowns to go and cities to go through what Detroit went through. We don't want to see dollar buildings all over these downtowns. And that's why it's important that we wrap our heads around this, reduce the scope of the crisis as much as possible, and then direct targeted solutions at the problem that we have to stabilize the tax base before things get that bad.
I also want to say something about Detroit. So I agree with everything that was just said. I think in addition, it illustrates that this is not a building by building problem. You need a neighborhood, a comprehensive solution. And there's very few places where you have a billionaire like Dan Gilbert that is able to just sort of single-handedly fix the problem, right? So we need coalitions of government and private sector to get together. In most of these other cities, there are lots of Midwestern cities that have beautiful buildings that are worth preserving, but where they don't have a Dan Gilbert. So I think as much as that's a nice example, we need to replicate something like that in other places like St. Louis and so forth, right?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. The Wall Street Journal had run an article about St. Louis just a few days before its article about Detroit, basically saying St. Louis is not the downtown there it's very problematic, I guess, the situation there. And they don't have the billionaire to come in. And can I ask you, Professor Van Nieuwerburgh, a sort of broader question about this? And we've been talking about how these the commercial real estate problems are affecting municipal budgets. To what extent does this have the potential to expand into something similar to what we saw in 2008 and 2009 with residential real estate, where it becomes a national or an international economic problem? I know, obviously, that residential real estate, there's much more debt than commercial real estate generally, but we are sort of starting to see, right, some banks, local banks with a lot of commercial real estate debt are having issues. Are you wary of what could come?
Yes, in the following sense. I don't think it's fortunately as big a problem in dollars as the subprime residential mortgage was. That said, it's a non-trivial problem. We have about $6 trillion of commercial real estate debt. Of course, only about a quarter of that is office, but still, that's almost $2 trillion, and half of that commercial real estate debt sits on banks' balance sheets, and actually mostly local banks, regional smaller banks. And there are many, many local small banks that have, their commercial real estate is three times their equity. Okay, so three times their capital. So if you think about that number for a second, if they lost, 20% or 30% on some of these loans, that could meaningfully eat into their equity. We saw Signature Bank in New York City collapse. They were a very heavy lender in this case on apartment buildings, but also on some office buildings. And I do think we will have some isolated bank failures. Sort of the good news is it's not our largest systemically risky banks. And then the other point, which I want to repeat, is that it's not as many dollars as the residential mortgage-backed security crisis.
Agreed on all points, and a few more things to add.
Sure.
So, one of the issues with housing is that a single family house has kind of like two settings. It's like a light. It's either it's on or it's off. Someone's living in the house or someone's not living in the house. It's cash flowing or it's not cash flowing. Office buildings aren't like that. Even an office building that is 50% vacant and has more debt on it than its valuation could still be a revenue positive asset, right? Half the building is occupied. There are people paying rent. There is money to go to the bank. It might not be as much as the bank is owed, but there are options on the table here that were not on the table in the residential mortgage crisis. I think it's critical that regulators allow banks to extend flexibility to office asset holders that have the ability to pay, but just not maybe the same way as they were paying prior to the pandemic, so that we can maintain liquidity in the commercial real estate sector.
If I can add one more thing. So I think the high interest rates that we are experiencing right now do make it very difficult for a lot of commercial real estate owners to refinance their debt. You should think of it as their debt service is going to double roughly compared to what they were paying 10 years ago. And now that their 10-year mortgage is up for renewal, they're looking at a doubling of debt service. There are something like 30 or 40% of office buildings that are in this situation where they would need to make a difficult decision, which is to come out of pocket and add capital, because the new loan that they're going to get is going to be substantially smaller than the one they need to refinance. And so the question is, are they going to put in new equity, or are the banks going to let them pay their old interest rates and try to modify the loan? I think we're seeing, or are they going to default? And I think we're seeing some of each. We're seeing about, last year in 2023, a third of mortgages paid off on time, a third was defaulted on, and a third was modified. And I'm personally a little bit worried that we're kicking the can down the road a couple of years by giving these modifications, these 2-year, typically 1 or 2 year modifications, and we're going to face a much larger problem 2 years down the road.
It is kicking the can down the road, but the idea is to avoid a financial crisis by spreading out by spreading out defaults. And I think that is a benefit to the global economy.
It is. I agree with that. I mean, it does it's an interesting trade-off, I think, because the discussion we were having earlier was all about making sure we don't let the vacancy fester and the neighborhoods go to hell. Now, the longer we allow these sort of half-empty office buildings to fester, the slower we are to really start to turn the corner on the neighborhoods and on the revitalization and on the reuse of some of these properties, which in my mind is inevitable. So we're sort of delaying the inevitable. And I think there's an optimal sequencing. We do not want to sell all these distressed office buildings at the same time. 100% agree with that. We also do not want to let it fester for 5 more years. So the question, what's sort of that optimal timing?
That's very interesting. Trying to find that balance between ripping the Band-Aid off and you sort of, kind of... To shift gears a little bit, cities in the United States, we did a conversation in the O'Connor Institute about rural America a while back, and one of the big takeaways was rural America as a description is not particularly useful because the rural Midwest is doing very well in a lot of ways. Rural Appalachia is just not. To what extent, are we seeing the different types of cities in the United States? And I guess I'm thinking most in terms of pre-war cities and post-war cities, cities that were designed before automobiles, cities that were built after automobiles. To what extent are these cities affected differently by this commercial real estate crisis that we're talking about? And I guess, Dr. Hadden, maybe you can start us off with that.
So I think the right explanatory variable is not like pre-war versus post-war.
Okay.
And that the challenge here is that if you look at places that experienced their period of greatest growth in the 70s and 80s during like the times when like the defense sector was expanding a lot, energy, those cities, their cores now have much higher concentrations of this like dated, obsolete 80s product than other places that maybe have more like beautiful historic,
okay,
yet dated product.
I see.
Yeah, and so even within those places, there are like different cities have different abilities to respond to the challenge of obsolescence within the core. So in along the Sun Belt, you will find more of what David Russ calls elastic cities. And those are cities that have either merged with their surrounding county or have expanded their boundaries in order to include additional activity centers that'll essentially allow them to like continue to have a strong commercial real estate tax base while their dated downtown just kind of sits there, right? So like that's why there's been double-digit office vacancy in downtown Houston, for example, for like 20 years. And Houston's about to have a bunch of fiscal problems, but Houston has tolerated double-digit vacancy in the downtown for a long time.
That's interesting.
But it's more of a problem in, for example, Washington, D.C., a region that grew a lot during that defense and energy boom and has a lot of that dated product, but is completely inelastic. The city cannot expand.
Yes. Professor Bindu?
Yeah, one more thing I would add to sort of in terms of the explanatory variables across cities is the share of jobs that are in the tech industry. I think that's sort of very highly correlated with office vacancy, and I think the idea is simple, which is the tech industry has been much more permissive towards remote work, and the places like Seattle, San Francisco that have a high exposure to that sector are the ones where we've seen some of the highest vacancy rates. But it's not a simple explanation. Los Angeles also has high CBD vacancy. Chicago has also high CBD vacancy. Minneapolis has very high CBD vacancy. So it's a complex story. It's not just technology. It's not just one factor. But it is surprisingly widespread. The differences. There's a very few cities that are doing well. Tucson is one of them. Miami is maybe another one. But it's hard to find a city with an office vacancy rate below 15%. Yeah.
We were talking about this earlier. I live in Tucson. It's a low vacancy because there's one office building, and that's that. So, but here's maybe a broader question, and maybe this is sort of a little bit of a philosophical question. We're talking a lot about downtowns. To what extent does downtown matter, Dr. Hadden? You were just talking about you were talking about Houston and sort of how they had sort of permitted these office vacancies downtown because they had expanded. Are we seeing this also in cities like Washington, D.C., where even though they can't expand to the extent that you're saying a Phoenix or a Houston could expand, where the economic activity that is leaving the downtowns is popping up in the places where people actually live? Are we seeing that? Is that?
Yeah. But I think I want to answer your question in a bigger way,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's like what you're asking is like, do we have to do something about this? Like, do we need downtowns, right? And the answer is like, is that um, we don't we don't need the downtowns we had in 2019.
Okay.
It's hard to hear, but the secret to recovery is not to try to go back, right? Because there's a because a lot changed during the pandemic for structurally forever.
Yeah.
And but that is not the same as there isn't a downtown of the future that is an adapted downtown, an evolved downtown, a different downtown that we still need. Downtowns still have completely unique locational advantages. They are at the center of their regions, they're highly accessible, and that remains an enduring value proposition. The issue is just that the kind of built environment, literally the kind of buildings
Mhm.
that are the highest and best use to connect to that locational advantage, that's changing. And so physically, downtowns have to change. The way that these buildings are built, designed, used, managed, that's that's what has to change. Not whether or not, like place still matters, right? 50% of jobs still done in person, 100%.
Yep.
Yeah, I want to add something to that. I agree with this, and I think ultimately, I keep coming back to the climate imperative, which is that sustainable living is dense urban living, and it's very hard to sort of escape that reality. And also, if you think about adaptation, it's just easier to protect, 20 million people that live in a small area, right? We can build a seawall in New York City because it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth preserving all of that investment and all of those people that are concentrated there. And so that's I think the ultimate solution. And indeed, like the way we transition to that world is one with a lot of adaptation to, what is it that people need, what are the technologies of the future. I was at an innovation summit yesterday, and there is just an incredibly vibrant innovation ecosystem in New York City going on right now. A lot of it has to do with clean tech, and that's where young people want to be. They want to work in these sectors. They want to be in a city like New York City, and it's very vibrant. It's economically vibrant, and the built environment will need to adjust to those needs over time.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize the point that Stein's making, that this isn't just like an aesthetic or like cultural preference to be in New York and be an innovator, right? It's not just like, oh, they like being in New York. It's that the the existence of the city in and of itself is related to the production of innovation. People in proximity, the effects of agglomeration are directly connected to innovation. And so there's a reason why people are starting companies in New York because the city bringing all of these people, all of these markets, all of these ideas into proximity is the spark that makes it possible for the fire to grow.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I'll be the devil's advocate here. Let me push back on this and ask you to respond, because I think I'm in agreement in the terms of what is sustainable and what we would like to see. But has the trend not been opposite of this? Has the trend not that we've seen in the past few years not been for people to want more space, less density, to do things from home? What will bring people? Or maybe I'm wrong, but if I'm not, what is it that's going to bring people back to this sort of dense urban environment that you're talking about? Maybe we start with Professor Van Nieuwerburgh and then
Yeah.
Dr. Hadden.
Look, I think Liam, you are right about this, which is that we have seen, at least the census statistics suggest that we have seen our densest urban areas lose population in the last 4 years. New York City, for example, according to the census statistics, has lost 550,000 people in the last 4 years. Now, there's some question about undercounting of, in particular, immigrants and so forth. And doing a census in the middle of a pandemic is never a good idea, or is never going to be reliable. But I think you're right that people did move to the suburbs. They did want more space. In fact, that in my mind is the best explanation for why house prices have risen so much in over that period, which is people just wanted all a little bit more space. They all wanted the home office, or they were living with two roommates and now they wanted to have their own apartment. And so, if everybody wants 10% more space, guess what? House prices are going to go up and rents are going to go up. And that's exactly what we saw. So what is going to bring people back? I think ultimately the government is going to have to play an important role, in particular when it comes to climate adaptation, and send price signals, right? Where it's, where basically if you want to keep commuting, it's, with your own gas car is going to become very, very expensive to do that, and so forth, right? And at the same time, we provide really good infrastructure in our downtown areas. We have walkable cities, and we make that very pleasant. And I think, it's going to take a concerted effort, I think, to move us back.
I think that we also need to build more housing in the right locations. That we can't be sure whether the movements of people reflect their real preferences, because they may not have access to all of the choices that they want to have. If we severely and systemically undersupply housing in walkable urban places, and then complain when people move to the suburbs, I think that we're sneaking around and lying to ourselves. So, especially for cities like New York and San Francisco, right? The high job growth, high cost. They should try building housing before they give up and assume that now everyone wants the suburbs.
Interesting. Okay, I think I get the sense that both of you are optimists, but I just want to confirm that as far as, the future of the city. Maybe you can both we can wrap up and you can sort of say where you see things going 5-10 years down the road in the future. I think I'm getting an optimistic vibe, but I just wanted to to ask you directly. Dr. Hadden, maybe you can start.
I am an optimist, but I am concerned about how difficult this challenge is going to be to respond to. I think that there's a huge political and governance challenge that cities are facing right now, because inequality is severe. There isn't unanimous agreement about what the problem is, much less what needs to be done about it. And you can see this on a host of issues, from building housing to paying for infrastructure to what to do about homelessness, et cetera. These are extremely difficult challenges for cities to solve in the context of inequality, because of the distance the psychological distance that puts between people, even if they're in physical proximity. So, I'm concerned. And while that challenge exists within cities, it also exists within regions where we are divided by jurisdictional boundaries. And, I think anyone who's paying attention to the fact that it's an election year is aware that this also exists within our nation. We have to come together in order to meet this challenge and to solve these problems. And coming together means talking to people who aren't like you, who don't 100% agree with you, and ultimately compromising. And I am worried about our ability to do that. But that is what's needed right now.
Very interesting. Dr. Van Nieuwerburgh?
Notwithstanding the moniker of doom that has been associated with some of my work, I also am cautiously optimistic about the future and the health of cities. I think the United States has a very vibrant economy. I think we've shown that very clearly in the last 5 years, where we've essentially outperformed any other economy in the world. And a lot of that rests on our creative, innovative capacity. And I think a lot of that has been associated with cities over the years. And it's crucial, I think, to preserve that, because that's not, on the point of coming together. I think sort of the whole country needs to realize that that's where where the engine of growth has been, and we cannot afford to underinvest in our cities and let that engine of growth let it sputter, right? So I think, that said, our cities are facing substantial problems. The office vacancy issue has not bottomed out yet. The value destruction has not happened yet. The tax hit has certainly not fully hit yet. So it's going to be a rough few years. But I think the only response is investment and good policy. And and policy, including, I think, some federal policy that says, yes, we got to invest in our major cities and preserve that engine of growth that we have come to rely on in the United States of America. And so I think that is, for me, the vision that combined with 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we really have to make substantial investments in climate adaptation. Time is running out very quickly. And again, dense urban living is sustainable living. And I think that has to somehow become a policy priority as well. And I think we need, through a combination of good government policy and market signals, to send that signal to people when they choose where to move. I think the challenges, I think, are enormous, but so is the opportunity. And I think so far, our economy has been robust, and I think we have a potential here to continue to outperform.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Drs. Hadden Lowe and Ben Nieuwerburgh, for spending some time with us and to give us your expertise and insight on this. It's very useful and very important stuff. So thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.